The warehouse on Sutter Industrial Road had no windows, just corrugated metal walls and a single bulb swinging on a wire above the concrete floor, throwing light that couldn't decide where to land. Reed Ashford stood in the center of that light. 36 years old, suit torn at the shoulder, knuckles split on both hands, a burn across his left palm that would blister by morning. The kind of man who'd walked into rooms like this before and walked out while others didn't. Tyson Beck was on the floor in front of him, breathing shallow, hands zip-tied behind his back with his own supplies. Reed looked down at his hands, turned them over slowly, and when his voice came, it was low enough that only the dark could hear it. "I'm sorry, Ginny," he said. "I'm sorry it took me this long." Outside, the Nevada desert stretched in every direction, enormous and indifferent and full of stars that didn't care what had just happened inside these walls. 48 hours earlier, none of this existed. 48 hours earlier, Reed Ashford didn't know her name. All he knew was that his father, a 63-year-old man with a cane and a bad right leg that hadn't worked right in 8 years, had driven 430 miles from Carson City to walk into a diner he shouldn't have walked into, looking for a daughter who'd been missing for 5 years. And 3 men had put him on the floor. And the only person in that room who'd stood up, the only one who'd stepped between an old man's body and a boot that was coming for it, wasn't family, wasn't muscle, wasn't anyone who owed Marshall Ashford a single thing. She was a 27-year-old waitress with green-gray eyes and hands that wouldn't stop shaking after her shift. A woman who'd been fighting alone in the dark for 2 years and never told a soul, and she'd looked at a man twice her size and said 3 words that changed everything that came after. If this story's already got you, hit like so I know to keep going. Share it with someone who won't sleep tonight without finishing it. And subscribe now because this one's far from over. Now let's go back to that diner, 48 hours before the warehouse, to the moment Sloan Mercer heard a cane hit the floor and made the only choice that mattered. 430 miles from Carson City to the outskirts of Las Vegas, Marshall Ashford drove straight through without stopping, pulling over only once for gas and a cup of cold coffee at a station outside Tonopah. A coffee whose taste he couldn't remember because his mind had been at Brennan's since before the tires rolled off his driveway. The business card sat in the breast pocket of his jacket, its corner curled, the ink smeared on the last word. He had found it 3 weeks earlier, in a cardboard box of Ginny's old things, a box he hadn't had the courage to open for 5 years, until one night when he had either enough courage or enough desperation, and he wasn't sure anymore where the line between those two things even was. The card had the diner's name and address on the front, and on the back, in Ginny's pencil handwriting, there was a single line he had read over and over, until the paper had grown thinner than the last letter Owen Mercer wrote to his sister from Afghanistan, though Marshall didn't know that and never would. He arrived at Brennan's at 5:47 on Thursday evening, while the sunlight was still yellow across the front of the place, the red and blue neon sign not yet lit. The word Brennan's missing its apostrophe, because the bulb had burned out and nobody had replaced it. He pushed the door open with his left hand, his right hand holding his cane, his right leg dragging slightly across the threshold in the way he had spent 8 years learning to hide, and had never managed to hide completely. The bell above the door rang. The diner was smaller than he had imagined. 4 booths, 5 counter stools, a small window opening into the kitchen, the smell of coffee and grease, and synthetic lemon from industrial cleaner, the smell of every working-class diner in America. Frank Doyle stood behind the register, and when Marshall walked in, something crossed Frank's face so fast most ordinary people would have missed it. But Marshall Ashford wasn't an ordinary man. He was a father who had spent 5 years learning how to read every room he entered, for traces of the daughter who never came home, and what he saw on Frank's face wasn't welcome and it wasn't surprise. It was fear, the kind of fear that had lived inside a man so long it was no longer a reaction but had become part of the landscape of his face. Beverly Kinney was wiping down the counter at the far end, 68 years old, her hands thick and steady, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this job in this place for more than 20 years. She looked up at Marshall, and her gaze was direct, unhidden, uncalculated, simply observant in the way of someone who knew too much and had stayed quiet too long. Then there was Sloan. She came out of the kitchen carrying 2 plates, set them down at a booth where a regular sat with his newspaper, said something that made him look up and smile, then turned, and in the instant before she had time to arrange her expression again, Marshall saw her real face. Blue-gray eyes with dark circles underneath. Not the kind that came from one bad night of sleep, but the kind built over months of carrying burdens no one shared. brown hair tied back in a ponytail that had lost its battle with the shift, hollow in the cheeks, at the collarbones rising above the neckline of her uniform in the unmistakable way that meant she wasn't eating enough. She saw Marshall and put her professional smile back on so quickly it was almost convincing. "Sit wherever you'd like," she said. "I'll be right with you." Marshall chose a stool at the counter near the register, where he could see the front door and the kitchen door and Frank Doyle's face all at once. Sloan brought him coffee. He thanked her. He took a sip. Then he asked in the ordinary tone of a man placing an order, though there was nothing ordinary at all in his eyes. "Hey, miss, I'm looking for someone, my daughter. She used to come here about 5 years ago. Her name was Genevieve. Everyone called her Ginny. Does anybody here remember her?" Sloane's hand stopped on the coffee pot, only for half a second, short enough that anyone who didn't know how to look would have missed it, but long enough for Marshall to know she knew that name, that it wasn't the first time she had heard it spoken inside this diner. Sloan set the pot down and said, "I haven't been working here very long. You can ask the owner." Then walked toward the kitchen without looking back, and Marshall Ashford sat at the counter with the coffee growing cold in front of him, and knew 2 things for certain. 1, the waitress was hiding something. 2, he had come to the right place, and both of those things made him stay instead of leaving, as night began to fall and the diner began to change temperature in a way he didn't yet understand. But his bones, the bones of a man who had lived 63 years and been broken and healed and broken again, were telling him to stay, to wait, because what he was looking for wasn't only on the business card in his breast pocket. It was here, in the fear on Frank Doyle's face, and in the careful silence of the blue, gray-eyed girl who had just turned and walked away. Marshall stayed. He ordered more coffee, ordered a slice of pie he didn't touch, and sat at the counter for the next 2.5 hours watching Brennan's change as darkness settled in. The way Frank glanced at the door every 15 minutes like a man waiting for something he feared more than hoped for. The way Bev moved more slowly, but her eyes moved faster once the neon outside flickered on and washed the diner floor in a faded red-blue haze. The way Sloan carried plates faster and smiled less, and twice he caught her looking at him from the kitchen, with the expression of someone weighing whether to say something but not yet deciding if the price of saying it would be worth it. Trouble arrived at 8:17. The door opened, and 3 men came in an order that told exactly who was who. The first through the door was big in the gym-built way, broad shoulders, thick neck, tattoos climbing above his collar, face red from liquor, moving with the arrogance of a man who had learned very early that body size was a kind of social license, and had reinforced that lesson every day since. Tyson Beck. Behind him came Logan Pratt, 30 years old, with flat, empty eyes in the way only people who had fully shut off some part of themselves could have. No expression, no flicker, just watching the door and waiting for orders. And Jesse Holt, 25, the youngest, trying to look dangerous by copying Beck's walk, but without any real weight behind it. So he looked more like an extra playing a villain than a real one. They chose the back booth. Sloan was pouring water for Marshall when they came in, and he saw her hand tighten around the pitcher, saw her shoulders go rigid by half an inch in the way only someone used to reading body language in dangerous situations would notice. And he understood at once that this girl knew exactly who had just walked through the door, and that she was afraid of them in the way people fear something that has hurt them many times, not just once. Frank, behind the register, went pale. He picked up a cleaning rag, set it down, then picked it up again, his hands doing what people's hands do when their minds are somewhere else entirely. And Marshall saw Frank glance toward him, then toward Beck, then down at the floor, and he understood, with the cold clarity of a father who had spent 5 years fitting together fragments, that Frank Doyle had told someone there was a man asking about Ginny, and that someone had just walked through the door. Beck sat down in the booth, ordered coffee in the voice of a man who didn't order but commanded, his eyes sweeping the room and stopping on Marshall for longer than necessary, long enough to assess him, long enough for Marshall to feel the weight of that stare on him like a hand placed on his shoulder. Then Beck stood up. He didn't go straight to Marshall. He moved around the counter slowly, the way a cat circles something it has already decided belongs to it but isn't in a hurry to pounce. And he stopped 2 stools away, leaned one elbow on the counter, and said loudly enough for the whole diner to hear, "This place isn't a nursing home, old man. At this hour you ought to be home watching television instead of sitting here asking questions and bothering people." Marshall didn't react. He didn't turn his head, didn't look at Beck, didn't tense his shoulders, didn't change his breathing. He lifted his coffee cup, took a sip, then set it back down on the counter with care. That silence wasn't the silence of a man who was afraid. It was the silence of a man who had lived 63 years and lost enough to know which men in front of him were truly dangerous and which ones were performing. And that distinction was plain on his face, in the way he held the cup, in the way he breathed, and Beck read it. And it made him angrier than any answer could have, because nothing insults a bully more than being dismissed by the very person he's trying to threaten. Beck stepped closer. "You've been asking questions, huh?" he said, his voice lower now, closer. "Asking about who, old man?" Marshall kept looking straight ahead, at the mirror behind the counter where he could see Beck's reflection behind him, and he said evenly, "I'm asking about my daughter. Is that a problem?" Beck didn't answer with words. He kicked Marshall's cane with his foot, hard, and the cane flew from Marshall's hand, clattering across the tile floor before coming to a stop beneath the base of an empty booth. Without the cane, Marshall had to grab the edge of the counter to keep his balance, and his right leg, the leg that had betrayed him for 8 years now, trembled under his weight, and Beck watched that with the smile of a man who had found exactly what he wanted, proof that the person in front of him was weak, the proof he needed to give himself permission for whatever he was about to do next. Beck didn't need any other reason. The smile on his face was already enough, and he used both hands to shove Marshall Ashford off the counter stool with the kind of force a man uses when he doesn't even need his full strength, for it to be more than enough to send a 63-year-old man with a dead right leg flying off the seat, his left shoulder hitting the tile floor first with a heavy, dull sound, like a sandbag dropped from waist height. Then his glasses flew off and skidded across the floor, spinning twice before stopping beneath the counter, and his right leg, the crippled one, bent at an angle where the pain was still on its way but hadn't yet arrived, because his body was still processing the fall before it could catch up to the hurt. "Die, old cripple," Beck said. Not shouted, said, in a normal voice, loud enough for the whole diner to hear, in the voice of a man who had said things like that so many times they were no longer insults but habit, the way he confirmed to himself and everyone in the room that he had the right to do whatever he wanted to, whoever he wanted, and no one would do a thing about it. And he was right. No one did a thing. Brennan's went solid with silence. Logan Pratt stood guarding the door, his flat eyes unblinking. Jesse Holt sat in the booth with a sneer, the sneer of a boy watching an adult do something cruel and finding it entertaining. Frank Doyle, behind the register, looked down at his hands, looked down at the countertop, looked anywhere that wasn't the old man on the floor, because looking at the old man on the floor meant admitting what he was seeing, and admitting meant having to do something. And Frank Doyle had run out of the ability to do something 5 years earlier, when they sent him the photograph of Maisie's left hand. Bev Kinney stood near the kitchen, her hand clenched around the dishcloth, her mouth pressed into a straight line, her eyes moving from Marshall on the floor to Sloan and staying there, as if she were waiting, counting down to something she knew was about to happen. The regular with the newspaper had already paid and disappeared out the back door at the speed of someone who had lived in this town long enough to know when he ought to be somewhere else. Marshall Ashford lay on the tile floor of Brennan's looking up at the ceiling, and he didn't try to get up right away, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew his right leg wouldn't cooperate without the cane, and his cane was in the middle of the floor about 3 yards away, and 3 yards with a useless leg might as well have been 3 miles. Then a hand picked up the cane, not Beck's hand, not Frank's or Bev's or anybody else's in the diner that had gone rigid with fear and the habit of silence. Sloan Mercer picked Marshall Ashford's wooden cane up off the floor, walked over to him, dropped down on one knee, and put the cane back in his hand, then slid her arm under his and helped him to his feet, slowly, carefully, with the precision of someone who had been trained in nursing school how to lift a patient without causing more damage, and her hand was warm and steady on his arm, even though 2 minutes earlier, that same hand had been trembling while she poured coffee. She put his glasses back on him. He looked at her. She looked at him. And in that moment, Marshall Ashford saw on the face of this 27-year-old girl something he recognized because he had seen it every morning in the mirror for the last 5 years. The look of a person who has endured too much for too long and has just reached the limit. The line where on one side is continuing to bow your head and on the other side is consequence. And she had just stepped across it. Sloan turned to face Beck. She had to tilt her head up to look at him because he was nearly a head taller than she was and outweighed her by at least 90 pounds. And that physical difference should have been reason enough for her to step back, but she didn't. She stood there in a grease-stained apron and a loosened ponytail and a pulse beating fast in her throat. Fast enough that Beck could clearly see it, but her feet didn't move. because she had decided that stepping back would cost more than standing still. Beck looked down at her with an expression that was half surprise and half amusement, the look of a cat when the mouse unexpectedly turns around and scratches back. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, squeezing it, his thumb pressing into the inside where the pulse beat, and there was nothing harmless in that gesture. It was a declaration of ownership, a reminder, and he spoke close to her face in a voice meant only for her. "You forgot who you are, Sloan. You forgot who's keeping you and your mother breathing." Marshall couldn't hear the words, but he saw the way they landed on Sloane's face, saw her eyes blink once as if she were swallowing something that tasted like iron. Then she opened them and didn't blink again, and looked Tyson Beck straight in the eye, and said loudly enough for everyone in Brennan's to hear every syllable, "Let go of my hand." 3 words. No shaking. No pleading. No pleas. 3 words spoken in a voice as steady as lake water before a storm. A voice she didn't know she had until she needed it. A voice each person finds only once in a lifetime when they've reached the end of endurance and discovered that what waits there isn't an abyss but solid ground. Brennan's went silent. Completely. The refrigerator in the kitchen hummed. The neon outside gave off its faint electric hiss. Everyone in the room held their breath. Beck still had her wrist. He hadn't let go, but he hadn't squeezed harder either, because those 3 words had done something he hadn't expected. They had turned the confrontation from private into public, from bully and victim into a choice everyone in the room was now witnessing. And whatever he did next would happen in front of all of them, and he was weighing that, calculating, deciding. When the diner's door opened, the door wasn't kicked in or thrown open. It opened with one hand, slowly, as if the door owed the man opening it time rather than the other way around. Sloan looked toward the entrance and saw him for the first time in her life, and later, she would remember that moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet, because the quiet carried by the man who stepped across the threshold of Brennan's at 8:23 on Thursday night came with a kind of gravity she had never felt from anyone entering any room she had ever stood in. Tall, lean in the way of a man who carried nothing extra, no extra weight, no extra motion, not one extra word that hadn't been calculated in advance. Black hair, gray eyes, the same color as the old man's eyes, the man she had just helped up from the floor. She recognized that immediately, but colder, farther away, like lake water you know is deep even though you can't see the bottom. A dark coat tailored to fit in the way expensive clothes fit when they are made for one body and one body only, the kind of coat Sloan estimated at 3 months of rent on her trailer. And the scar, when he pushed his sleeve back slightly at the wrist, she saw it. Long, old, running from his left wrist to his elbow, telling the story that someone had once tried to kill him and had failed, and he didn't bother hiding the mark because hiding it would have meant he still thought about it. And he had stopped thinking about it a long time ago. Behind him came 2 men no one had invited and no one needed to invite. The first was as broad as a double door, 40 years old, his eyes sweeping the room from left to right in the way only men with military training sweep a room, assessing threats, finding exits, done in 3 seconds. Conrad Walsh. Sloan didn't know his name then, but she knew the way he stood, weight low, shoulders open, hands never far from his body. She had seen her brother Owen stand exactly that way in the photographs he sent home from Afghanistan. The second man was more compact, 37 years old, Drew Sato, moving with the light precision of a scalpel, no wasted motion, no performance, only arriving exactly where he needed to be. The gray-eyed man crossed the diner floor, and Sloan saw the moment his eyes found Marshall Ashford, the old man clinging to the bar with a cane in one hand and a stain from the tile floor on his coat shoulder, his glasses slightly crooked because she had put them back on him in a hurry. And what moved across the younger man's face wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something that came before anger, something colder and more exact. Recognition, storage, the way a machine scans a barcode and saves the data before deciding what to do with it. He didn't go to his father first. He went to Beck. And the way he walked, Sloan would remember forever. Not fast, not slow. Every step the same distance, the same rhythm, the walk of a man who had already done the calculation before his first foot touched the floor. He stopped in front of Beck at a distance of 2 steps. Close enough for Beck to smell the cologne at his collar, the kind that cost a month's rent for anyone in this diner. Far enough that if Beck moved, that distance would become attacking distance, not defensive distance. "Let her go," he said, and his voice was something Sloan would carry long after this night, even, not heated, not raised. The kind of voice that didn't need volume because it came from a place volume couldn't reach. The place where decisions had already been made, and words were only the final courtesy before action took over. Beck looked at him, looked at Con behind him, looked at Drew, and for one moment something intelligent moved across his face. The survival instinct that had kept him alive to 42 by reading threats correctly. Then liquor and ego drowned it. "You know who I am," Beck said. "Tyson Beck," the gray-eyed man said. Not as a question, owner of 3 bars in Clark County, 2 of them losing money, owing $340,000 in federal taxes, 1 ex-wife in Reno, 1 restraining order violated 3 times, 1 warehouse on Sutter Industrial Road you think nobody knows about. Every word dropped into Brennan's like a stone falling down a well, and Sloan counted them the way she counted a patient's heartbeat in nursing school. Each fact 1 beat. Each beat 1 piece of proof that the man standing in front of her wasn't guessing. He knew, and he knew in the way only men who possessed a very specific kind of power knew. The kind of power information flowed toward the way water flowed downhill. "I know who you are, Beck," he said. "The question is whether you know who I am." And Beck did. Sloan saw the moment recognition struck his face, not from his expression but from his hand. His hand released her wrist, fingers opening one by one, as if they were obeying a different brain from the one controlling his mouth. An older brain, a survival brain, a brain saying let go right now. Her wrist was free. Beck's fingerprints still marked her skin, red, and they would bruise by morning. The diner's door opened again, and Deputy Grant Sutton walked in, 26 years old, hand on his belt, eyes moving over a room whose temperature had completely changed from the ordinary temperature of a Thursday night diner. Sutton took statements for 15 minutes, writing in his notebook, answers that contained nothing. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. Nothing happened, and Sloan watched the pen move across the page recording emptiness, while the truth stood all around the room so heavy the air had gone thick. And she understood with cruel clarity that the system wasn't broken. The system was working exactly as designed. It had been designed not to see. Sutton left. Beck stood, dropped money on the table. Logan and Jesse followed, and he walked toward the door slowly, not in a hurry, because hurrying would mean he was afraid, and Beck wouldn't allow anyone in the room to think he was afraid, even if his hand had already said otherwise. He stopped at the door, one hand holding it open, and his eyes found Sloan across the room, found her, and held her. And what was on his face wasn't anger, wasn't shame, but something colder, more careful, a promise, the kind never spoken aloud, the kind the person receiving it knows exactly for what it is, and carries with her every time she looks through the diner window into the dark parking lot at the end of a shift. Then he stepped outside and the door shut, and Brennan's breathed, person by person, thing by thing. Like lungs that had just been released from a tightening strap, Reed told Con to take his father back to the hotel. And Con didn't ask why, didn't ask who was staying behind. He only looked at Reed for 1 second, read the answer in his boss's eyes, then nodded and guided Marshall out through the back door, one hand light on the old man's elbow in the way Con Walsh did everything. Just enough force, just enough attention, nothing extra, nothing lacking. And Drew followed without being told because Drew Sato didn't need to be told anything involving security. He read a situation and reacted like a program already installed. Marshall stopped at the door and looked back at Reed. And in his eyes there was a question he didn't ask out loud. "Son, what are you staying for?" But he didn't ask because Marshall Ashford, even without knowing what his son was, knew who his son was, and his son was a man who didn't explain his choices until those choices were already finished. The back door shut. The sound of a car starting outside in the lot, backing out, then fading onto Route 9. Brennan's emptied out. Bev had said goodnight and gone through the back door 10 minutes earlier, giving Reed one long look filled with complicated information he hadn't fully decoded before she disappeared around the corner. Frank had turned off the kitchen lights and retreated into the office at the back. The sound of the door closing soft but hurried. The sound of a man who wanted to disappear from his own room. That left Reed and Sloan. She stood behind the register counting money. Her hands were shaking. Not much, but enough for the $10 bill between her fingers to tremble lightly at the edge. And she had to count twice because the numbers didn't match, or because her mind was somewhere else, or both. Reed sat on the counter stool, right where Marshall had been sitting, a cup of cold coffee in front of him, and he said nothing. He had learned through too many years and too many rooms that sometimes the most useful thing a person could do was be present without demanding anything from the other person, not demanding an explanation, not demanding gratitude, not demanding conversation, just being there so the other person knew they weren't alone in an empty room at 10:30 at night after the world had just been turned upside down. Sloan counted, slid the bills into the drawer, closed it, opened it again, counted again. Her lips moved with the numbers, but her eyes weren't on the money. They were fixed somewhere in between, the place people look when they're calculating something larger than cash in a drawer, something tied to the 3 words she had just spoken and the price she'd have to pay for them when Beck came back. Because Beck would come back. She knew that as surely as she knew, her mother needed the next round of chemotherapy in less than 2 weeks. "You don't need to stay," she said without looking up. "I know," Reed said. "He won't come back tonight." "Probably not." Silence, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the faint hiss of the neon outside the door, the sound of the Nevada desert doing what the desert does at night, widening, settling, becoming something larger than anything human beings build inside it. Sloan closed the register drawer one last time and looked up, and her blue-gray eyes met Reed's gray eyes in the way only very tired people look, without filters, without the architecture of politeness and self-protection people build between themselves and strangers, just looking, and she asked, "Why are you here, really?" Reed set the cold coffee cup down on the counter. "Because my father was on the floor," he said, "and you were the only person in this diner who stood up." She looked at him for another second. Then she turned back to work, because work was what Sloan Mercer returned to when she didn't know what else to do with what she had just heard. And she started wiping tables with the automatic motions of someone who had done this hundreds of times, while her mind was somewhere else entirely. Reed stood and picked up a chair, turned it upside down onto a table. Nobody asked him to. He simply picked up one chair and set it there, then the next, then the next, his scarred knuckles and the long scar down his arm moving among the diner's cheap plastic chairs, with the ease of a man who considered no work beneath him, and Sloan watched him from the other side of the room, watched hands that clearly knew things far more expensive than plastic chairs, watched the way he stacked them neatly and evenly, and she didn't say thank you, because she didn't know what kind of thank you belonged in a moment where a stranger had just driven her nightmare out of the diner and was now stacking chairs for her as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. When the last chair was on the table and the diner lights were turned off except for the pale green exit light, Sloan put on her coat and they went out the back door into the parking lot. The night was warm and dry and full of stars, the Milky Way sweeping clear from one horizon to the other. Sloan's Honda Civic was parked in the far corner, the windshield cracked by a diagonal line from left to right, and when she started the engine, it sounded like something begging to be allowed to rest and being denied. Reed stood in the parking lot watching the Civic's taillights grow smaller on the dark road. 2 red points, then 1, then none. And he stood there a while longer after they disappeared, standing in the Nevada night, with stars overhead and the smell of dry dust and old gasoline around him, and he thought about the girl who had just driven away, about the blue-gray eyes and the trembling hands and the 3 words and the way she had picked his father's cane up from the floor. And he thought about Ginny, about the photograph on his phone, about the smile that had never quite finished, and he found something in himself he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't interest, and it wasn't strategy. It was the recognition that the 27-year-old girl, driving that cracked windshield Civic into the dark, was living the version of life Ginny should have been allowed to live if, 5 years earlier, someone had stood between her and the dark, and no one had stood there, and he hadn't stood there. And that truth settled onto his chest with a weight he recognized immediately, because he had carried it for 5 years already. Only tonight, it had a new face. Con Walsh drove back into the lot, parked beside Reed's Harley, and rolled down the window. "You heading out, boss?" Reed didn't turn right away. "Find me everything on Sloan Mercer," he said. "Everything. Family, finances, medical, background, who she owes, who owes her, before morning." Con didn't ask why. Con Walsh never asked why. He rolled the window back up and drove away. And Reed stood alone in Brennan's parking lot, looking up at the Nevada sky, where the stars were doing what stars had always done, burning without caring about anything happening below them. The light in Frank Doyle's office window was still on at midnight, a thin yellow rectangle against the dark wall behind the diner, the kind of light that belongs to a man who can't sleep and has stopped pretending he will. Reed went back to Brennan's alone, without Con, without Drew, because what he needed from Frank Doyle wasn't the kind of thing that required bodyguards. It was the kind that required silence, and a room small enough that the man inside it would have nowhere to hide from the truth of his own life. He knocked on the back door. A long silence, then the scrape of a chair pushed back. Then slow, heavy footsteps. The door opened and Frank Doyle stood there in the yellow light, shirt unbuttoned at the top, his face showing everything it had hidden all evening. 60 years old, but looking older. Not the kind of old labor creates, because that kind makes a person look solid and real, but the kind guilt creates, hollowed from the inside, the shell of a building whose structure has rotted through but hasn't fallen yet, only because no one has pushed it. "I figured you'd come," Frank said. "Come in." The office was small, just enough room for a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet no one had organized in years. A photograph was pinned to the wall above the desk, its edges soft from moisture and kitchen grease. A 22-year-old girl, with Frank's eyes but brighter, caught in the middle of a laugh, the laugh unfinished because the picture had been taken half a second too early, so she was preserved forever on the edge of joy without ever making it all the way there. "Maisie," Reed said. "Her high school graduation day," Frank said. "June of 2021, 3 months before she disappeared." They sat down. Frank poured bourbon into 2 glasses, too unclean to deserve being called glasses, but good enough for the purpose of this night. Reed held his drink but didn't touch it. "Tell me," he said. And Frank told him. 40 minutes without stopping. Not entirely in order. Because 5 years of pressure, finally finding a way out, doesn't pour in a straight line. It pours like water after a dam breaks, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes circling back, sometimes stopping while a man stares at the floor before he can go on. Maisie was 22 years old and wanted to leave Redemption Falls in the way every smart child wants to leave every small town. Not because the town is bad, but because she had grown larger than what it could hold. She'd been accepted to a school in Las Vegas. The tuition was almost covered. She was short $2,000, and desperate in the specific way of someone who can see exactly what she wants and knows exactly what stands between her and it. Beck came into the diner one Thursday afternoon, charming in the way he could be when he needed to be. Overheard Maisie talking to a friend about money, and offered her work serving at a private event. Good money, legal, nothing suspicious. She said yes. Of course she said yes. She was 22, and short $2,000 from her future. That was September 14th, 2021. Frank remembered the date the way people remember the day their life split into before and after. She called him while driving to the address Beck had given her. Said the neighborhood looked strange, but the money was real. She'd checked. Said she'd call back when she got there. She never called back. Before midnight, he called the police. Before 2 a.m, the police had come to take his statement. A week later, the investigation had gone nowhere. And later, Frank would understand that it wasn't because of incompetence, but because of something worse. The following month, a man Frank had never seen before sat in the diner after closing and explained in a calm voice, as if describing a business arrangement, that Maisie was alive and would remain alive as long as Frank kept his mouth shut, kept the diner open, and did what he was told when he was told. "And you agreed," Reed said. Not a question. "She was alive," Frank said, his voice flat, too far past excuse. "They showed me pictures. She was looking into the camera holding that day's newspaper. She was alive. Tell me what you would have done." Reed didn't answer. He thought about Ginny, about the Thanksgiving photograph, about 5 years, and he knew exactly what he would have done because he knew exactly what he had done. He had built an empire out of ashes to find his sister, and that wasn't more moral than what Frank had done. It just involved more money. "The first time they told me to bring someone in," Frank said, "I refused." 2 days later, they sent a picture of Maisie with her left hand in a different condition than it had been in the previous picture. He stopped, looked at his own hand. "That was the last time I refused." 28, Reed said. 28. Frank repeated, and the number lay between them like an object with real physical weight. Not all from the diner. For some, I only provided information, who was in trouble, who wouldn't be missed right away if they vanished. Some I led there with fake excuses, extra shifts, private work, catering events, every time I told myself it was for Maisie, every time I knew that was a lie. He stopped. "You can't do what I've done and call it love. That's not love. That's cowardice wearing better clothes. Reed looked at Maisie's picture on the wall, forever at the edge of an unfinished smile. Sloan Mercer, he said. Frank looked down at the desk. She's next. Beck told me to offer her $3,500 for one night serving a private event tonight. The amount was exactly what her mother's next round of chemotherapy would cost. They're exact about that. They know exactly who to target and exactly how much it takes to make the invitation sound possible. When were you going to offer it to her? Reed asked. Tonight, right after her shift, Frank said, almost voiceless. Reed let silence sit between them long enough for Frank to feel its full weight. Then he said, Tell me about the warehouse. Frank described it the way people describe a place from a nightmare. Through sensory details the mind keeps against its own will. Corrugated metal walls, the smell of concrete and dust, and something chemical underneath it. The doors, the single bulb hanging from a wire, the breaker panel on the east wall near the northeast corner. Breaker panel, Reed said. Old lock, Frank said. The kind that's been there too long. Key corroded. Body worn down by too many seasons. Old breakers. One of them trips all the time. Has for years. They never fixed it. He looked at Reed. I don't know why I'm telling you that. I do, Reed said. And he did. 18 seconds. 18 seconds of full darkness inside an enclosed space, if the main breaker was pulled. 18 seconds that the right person with the right knowledge could create from an old electrical panel. He had been trained enough, had stood in enough dark rooms, to know what 18 seconds of complete disorientation does to the human threat response. Darkness wasn't absence. Darkness was a weapon. Reed stood. What are you willing to do to make this right? He asked. Frank looked at him for a long time. I'm afraid, he said. I've still been afraid, every day for 5 years. But I'm more afraid of what I'm becoming than of what they'll do to me. Reed nodded once. That was enough. Not because the answer was brave, but because it was real. And Reed Ashford had lived in his world long enough to know that real was the only thing you could build anything on without it collapsing. Reed stepped out the back door of Brennan's into the desert night, and Bev Kinney was standing there, not just arriving, but waiting, having been there before Reed went into Frank's office, her low-soled shoes planted on the gravel of the parking lot, her arms folded across her chest in the way of someone who had already decided what she was about to do and was only waiting for the right moment. And Reed understood at once that she had heard, through the open window or through the thin walls of the old diner, she had heard Frank confess, and she had waited for him to finish, because she respected his right to speak his own guilt before she came to add the part he didn't know. You haven't heard all of it yet, Bev said. No greeting, no preamble, in the voice of a 68-year-old woman who had been silent too long and had decided tonight was the last night she would stay silent. Reed looked at her in the weak light, spilling from Frank's office window, her face the kind made by weather and years rather than worry. The lines clear, the eyes sharp, the thick hands resting on her forearms, every finger telling the story of 22 years of carrying plates and wiping counters and watching everything pass through Brennan's without saying a word until now. Frank told you about the 28 women, Bev said, and he told the truth. He didn't hide the number, but there's something he doesn't know, because no one told him. And I kept quiet because saying it sooner would have gotten the person I was trying to protect killed. Reed waited. She went on. Sloan Mercer isn't just Beck's next target, she said. She's been on the inside for 2 years. Reed knew this much. Frank had said Sloan was being forced to help. But the way Bev said on the inside carried different weight. It didn't stop there, and he saw on her face that what came next was the part she had protected and kept, and was now handing over to him like the key to a locked safe. Every job Beck made her help prepare, Bev said. Every girl she was told to lure in or gather information on or arrange, Sloan sabotaged it from the inside. Bev paused for a second so Reed could truly hear it. She warned them. She found ways to tell them not to go. If she couldn't warn them in time, she left clues for the police. Small things, things Beck wouldn't notice. A phone number written on the back of a receipt and left in the right place. An anonymous message sent from a prepaid phone. One time, she deliberately drove the wrong way long enough for the girl in the car to jump out at a gas station and run. 9 women, Bev said. Over 2 years, 9 women got out because of Sloan Mercer. Reed stood in the Brennan's parking lot at 1 a.m. listening to that number, and it struck his chest in a place completely different from where Frank's 28 had landed. It struck the place where he kept Ginny. The place where for 5 years he had carried the question of what if someone had stood between his sister and the dark that night. And now he was staring at the answer in the form of a 27-year-old girl with blue-gray eyes driving a Civic with a cracked windshield, who had gone home 3 hours earlier while he knew none of this. "Beck doesn't know," Bev said. "He thinks she's obedient, thinks she's afraid, thinks threatening her mother is enough to keep her in line. Frank doesn't know because Sloan never told him. She knew Frank was weak, and weak people leak. She was right about that. Tonight he called Beck the minute Marshall started asking questions. You know why?" Reed asked, not asking how Bev knew, but why Sloan would do it when the price could be her life and her mother's life. Bev looked at him in the way only someone who had lived nearly 7 decades can look at a person, with patience reserved for questions the one asking already knows the answer to, but still needs to hear spoken aloud by somebody else. "Because she couldn't not do it," Bev said. She paused. "I saw her the first night after the first job, the night she let a girl go off with Beck because she didn't yet know how to stop it. I saw her sitting in the kitchen after closing, staring at her hands, and I knew that look because I had seen it on Garrett's face, on Frank's face, on the face of everyone who had ever let something terrible happen while standing close enough to stop it, the look of a person who had just learned who they were when tested, and didn't like the answer. But Sloan was different from them because Sloan didn't stay with that answer. She changed it. From the second time on, she changed it. A little each time. Quietly. Alone. With no one knowing. No one thanking her. No one standing in a parking lot at 1 a.m. telling her she was brave. Reed was silent for a long time. He thought about Ginny somewhere in the dark 5 years ago with no one standing between her and what was happening. He thought about Sloan standing between the dark and 9 women she didn't know, didn't owe, had no reason to protect except the only reason that ever matters, that she was there and she could, and so she had to. He thought about the distance between those two things, between no one standing there and one person standing there, and that distance was the distance between Ginny disappearing and 9 women still being alive, and the girl who had created that distance was asleep somewhere in a trailer outside Las Vegas, with the words, "Let go of my hand," still echoing inside the empty diner. "How long have you kept this secret?" Reed asked. "Since I saw her in the kitchen that night," Bev said. 18 months. "And you're telling me now because why?" "Because you walked into that diner tonight and she's running on fumes," Bev said. And for the first time her voice wasn't entirely steady. 2 years of fighting alone in the dark without telling anyone is too long for anybody. And she's getting close to the edge. And the edge of Sloan Mercer is a place where I don't want to find out what happens if she goes past it. Bev turned and walked into the night, the careful steps of someone whose joints had developed opinions of their own. And Reed stood alone in the parking lot for the second time that night, watching someone disappear into darkness. And this time, he didn't think about Ginny. He thought about Sloan, about 9 women, about 2 years. And he knew with the cold clarity he used to make every most important decision of his life, that that girl wasn't going to fight alone for 1 more day. Reed got 3 hours of sleep, lying on the hotel bed staring at the ceiling until his eyes finally closed sometime near 4 a.m, and he woke at 7, with the instincts of a man who had lived long enough in a world where sleeping too deeply could become your last mistake. He was drinking black coffee at the table in his room. The map of the warehouse he had sketched from Frank's description spread out in front of him, with red pen notes, marking the breaker panel on the east wall, when the knock came at 8:30. Khan opened the door, and the woman standing in the hallway wasn't who Khan had expected. 41 years old, wearing a Las Vegas Metro police uniform, black hair pulled back at the nape of her neck, dark brown eyes looking straight past Khan Walsh, as if he were the second door she needed to open rather than an obstacle, and she stepped across the threshold without waiting to be invited in with the ease of someone used to entering rooms where the people inside didn't want her there. "Lieutenant Nina Valdez," she said, looking at Reed and not at Khan. "Human Trafficking Unit. And before you say anything, I know who you are, Mr. Ashford. I know what the Ashford Empire is. I know you were at Brennan's last night, and I'm here because we want the same thing, even if it's for very different reasons." Reed looked at her for 3 seconds, the kind of look he used to measure everyone, not to find a weakness this time, but to find what was real, to see where the person in front of him was speaking from books, or from the place books never write about. He gave Khan a slight nod, and Khan stepped outside and shut the door. And Nina Valdez sat down in the chair across from Reed Ashford in a motel room on the outskirts of Las Vegas at 8:30 on Friday morning, and told him what he didn't yet know, the part above Beck and Frank and Brennan's, the part that, if this were an iceberg, made everything he had seen the night before only the small piece rising above the water. Dale Whitmore, she said, a United States Senator, Senate Judiciary Committee, the man who appeared on television every week talking about protecting vulnerable women and fighting human trafficking with a serious face and a trustworthy voice and a perfectly tailored suit, and Reed recognized the description because he had seen that face on a screen, had heard that voice, had once believed this was one of the few men left inside the system who was actually doing the work. Whitmore is the financial architect, Nina said, her voice flat and exact in the way voices become flat when someone has lived with the truth long enough for the first anger to condense into something colder and more useful. He designed and runs the trafficking pipeline that has moved more than 250 women through the Las Vegas corridor, down into Arizona, and then across the Mexican border over the last 7 years. Beck is muscle. Frank is the smallest link. Whitmore is the man signing checks and giving orders, and sitting in a Senate office reading reports about the very victims he created. Reed said nothing for 30 seconds after that. And 30 seconds with Reed Ashford was a very long time. Then he asked why no one had stopped him. Craig Hollis, Nina said. The FBI agent in charge of organized crime in southern Nevada, 53 years old, 28 years in service, a spotless reputation to anyone who hadn't looked from the right angle. Nina had looked from the right angle 20 months earlier, following a thread that began with a protected witness disappearing before trial and ended in payment trails that led to accounts that led to Hollis. He blocks every investigation, Nina said. Evidence disappears. Witnesses recant or vanish. I went around him twice. Both times the information reached Hollis before it reached anyone who could act. I don't know who in the chain belongs to him, so I stopped going through the system. For 20 months, Nina said. I've been building a case file outside all official channels. Evidence Hollis can't touch because he doesn't know it exists. But there's one thing I'm missing. A direct link between Whitmore and a specific transaction. His name on the chain of command. On tape. Something I can take to a federal judge I trust, without having to pass through Hollis's network. And you need someone inside the warehouse, Reed said. Tonight, Nina said. Big transfer night. 15 to 18 women gathered at the warehouse on Sutter Industrial, loaded into transport trucks before Saturday morning. I need someone inside wearing a recording device to establish the chain of command on tape. Names, direct orders, tying back to Whitmore's structure. At the same time, my team intercepts Whitmore at the handoff point in Nogales. He always comes to the major transfers. For control, he needs to see them with his own eyes. The warehouse gives me the structure. Nogales gives me the man. Only both at once gives me the case. Sloan Mercer, Reed said. It wasn't a question. Nina looked at him. She's been inside for 2 years. Beck trusts her. She's the only one who can walk into that warehouse without raising suspicion. Reed stood from the chair and walked to the window, looking out at the motel parking lot where the early Nevada sun had already begun turning everything white, and he stood there with his back to Nina Valdez, thinking about the 27-year-old girl who was working the morning shift at Brennan's right now, carrying plates and pouring coffee and bearing weight on her shoulders he had only learned existed 12 hours earlier, while she had been carrying it for 2 years. She's 27, he said, still facing the window. She's working doubles to pay for her mother's chemotherapy. You're asking me to send her into that warehouse with Tyson Beck. She's being sent in whether we exist or not, Nina said. Frank is supposed to offer her $3,500 this morning. That was Beck's plan. The question is whether she gets to choose how she goes in. Reed turned back. He looked at Nina Valdez the way he looked at everyone one last time before deciding which side of the line in his head they stood on. And on her face he saw something he had seen on very few faces in his life, the exhaustion of someone who had done the right thing for too long, inside a system that kept doing the wrong thing, and had stayed anyway because leaving would have meant surrender, and surrender wasn't in their vocabulary. I talked to her, Reed said. She decides for herself. I don't decide for her. And if she says no, Nina asked. Reed looked at her with the same gray eyes that had recited Tyson Beck's history in the diner the night before in front of everyone. Then I find another way, he said. And the other way won't be polite. Reed found Sloan at 2 o'clock Friday afternoon at Brennan's. She was working the lunch shift, moving between the tables with the same practiced precision as the night before, but half a beat slower, more tired. A few hours of sleep, not nearly enough to replace what she had spent the previous night and what she was carrying into the new day, and Reed watched her carry plates across the diner floor and thought that this was the person Bev had said had been fighting alone for 2 years, the person 9 women owed their lives to without knowing her name, and she was refilling coffee for the old man in the corner, as if this were the most ordinary day of her life. He sat at the counter. When Sloan came over to pour coffee for him, he said quietly, "Frank didn't offer you $3,500 this morning." Her hand stopped on the pot for half a second, then kept pouring. "I know," she said. "He avoided my eyes all morning. First time in 2 years he didn't look at me during shift change, and I knew something had changed." Reed looked at her and decided she deserved to hear the whole truth, not a filtered version, because Sloan Mercer had been living inside the heart of the truth for 2 years, and to cut it down now would have been an insult to her. So he told her. The warehouse on Sutter Industrial. 15 to 18 women being gathered tonight for transfer before Saturday morning. Beck running the site. Above Beck was Senator Dale Whitmore, a man she might have seen on television talking about protecting women, and if she had, then everything he said was a lie wrapped in a $3,000 suit. FBI agent Craig Hollis, blocking every investigation from the inside. Lieutenant Nina Valdez had built a case file outside the system for 20 months and needed someone to wear a recording device into the warehouse tonight to establish the chain of command on tape to connect Beck to Whitmore before a federal judge. At the same time, Nina's team would intercept Whitmore in Nogales at the border. Only both ends at once would make the case hold. Sloan listened without interrupting. She set the coffee pot down on the counter and gripped the edge with both hands, not because she needed to hold herself up, but because her body was processing the scale of what she had just heard and needed an anchor point while her mind finished the calculation. "How many people?" she asked. 15 to 18 in the warehouse tonight," Reed said. "More than 250 if Whitmore keeps operating." Sloan looked down at the countertop. "My mother was diagnosed 3 years ago," she said, and Reed understood that she wasn't changing the subject. She was placing everything on the same scale so she could see it clearly before deciding. "Lung cancer. She never smoked a single day in her life, but my father smoked all the time, and my father died 11 years before she did, and she was the one left to pay for it. Terminal stage for the last 8 months. The next round of chemotherapy has to start within 2 weeks or the doctor says the window closes, and once the window closes, it doesn't open again. $4,200. That's the out-of-pocket after insurance, and I'm short all of it." She looked up. "That's why Beck controls me. Not because I'm afraid of him. I am, but that's not why. It's because my mother will die if I don't get the money. And he knows that, and he uses that. And every month the number is exact, always exact down to the dollar I need, and I hate him for that more than for anything else he's ever done." She stopped. "My brother Owen was a Marine," she said, and her voice changed when she said his name, half a tone softer, the way people's voices soften when they speak of the dead they still love in the present tense. "He was killed in Afghanistan in 2017. Roadside bomb. He was 23. He used to say the hardest part of his job wasn't the danger, it was the choice. Every morning in a war zone, he had to choose whether he was the person who ran toward danger or the person who found a reason to wait. He said that choice got easier with practice, but it never got easy." She paused longer this time. "He chose 100 times. Then one time the wrong vehicle was in front of him, and that was it. I don't want to end up like Owen. I want to finish nursing school and take care of my mother and live some version of a normal life." She looked at Reed. "But I also don't want to be the person who knows and does nothing. I was that person once, the first night, when I let a girl go and didn't stop it. And afterward I sat in the kitchen looking at my hands and swore I'd never be that person again." "Both of those things are true," Reed said. "They don't cancel each other out." "No," Sloan said. "They don't." Reed took an envelope from the inside pocket of his coat and set it on the counter. And before Sloan could say no, the way she would have said it last night, if anyone had offered her money, he said, "This isn't charity. It's an investment in the only person who's been doing the right thing for 2 years without anyone paying her a cent. $5,000. Enough for your mother's bill and 2 months of arrears. The Federal Assistance Fund will cover the rest." Nina guaranteed that. "And if anything happens in that warehouse tonight, I'll handle it personally. With my life, not because I'm a good man, but because I owe you that. Even if you don't know why. When you're steady again, find someone who needs it and pass it on. That's the only repayment I want." Sloan looked at the envelope on the counter. Looked for a long time. She didn't ask why he owed her. She didn't ask what $5,000 meant to a man wearing a coat that cost more than 3 months of her rent. She didn't ask anything, because Sloan Mercer was the kind of person who read the answer on someone else's face before they said it out loud. And she had read on Reed Ashford's face the night before, when he stacked chairs in the empty diner, that he carried something as heavy as or heavier than what she carried. And that thing had the face of a girl. And now the envelope on the counter was his way of paying a debt to that face through hers. She picked up the envelope, folded it once, slid it into her jacket pocket. She didn't thank Reed, and he respected that, because thank you would have turned it into charity. And it wasn't charity. And they both knew it. "Tell Nina I agree," she said. "Tell her I want every detail before I walk in. And I want to speak to her directly before I officially agree to anything." She looked at Reed, and her blue-gray eyes weren't tired now, or maybe they still were. But beneath the tiredness there was something else, something her brother Owen would have recognized immediately, because it was what he had seen in the mirror every morning in Afghanistan before stepping out the door, the clarity of someone who had already chosen, who knew the price, and went anyway. "And tell her," Sloan said, "that if this goes bad and I don't make it out, somebody has to make sure my mother's bill gets paid, no matter what." "I guarantee it," Reed said, "personally, with my life." Sloan held his eyes for one more second. Then she picked up the coffee pot and went down the counter to the next customer. And Reed sat at the counter of Brennan's watching her walk away and thought about Owen Mercer, 23 years old, choosing 100 times, then the 101st time finding the wrong vehicle in front of him. And he thought about Sloan, 27 years old, who had just chosen, and was walking away with an envelope in her jacket pocket and a coffee pot in her hand, toward something she didn't yet know the full shape of, but had decided to face because she was the person Owen had taught her to become, the person who runs toward danger. And for the first time in many years, he prayed that tonight wouldn't be her 101st time. Reed didn't sleep that night. That wasn't unusual. Sleep had been a negotiation since he was 28, when the scar on his left arm was still new, and he lay in a hospital bed for 3 weeks, wondering whether the empire he was building was worth the price he had just paid. And sleep had become even more of a luxury after Ginny disappeared, something he reached only sometimes by driving himself so far into exhaustion that his mind could no longer keep its own machinery running. On the nights when exhaustion wasn't enough, he lay in the dark and let the thoughts come, didn't fight them, didn't push them away, just let them pass through him like cars on a highway seen from a motel window. And tonight the thoughts came harder than usual, and sharper. He thought about Ginny. Thanksgiving, 5 years and 4 months earlier. The kitchen in the old house outside Reno, where Marshall was still living then before moving back to Carson City, and Ginny standing at the counter cutting something he couldn't remember anymore, looking up at the camera, her hair loose, smiling, wearing an oversized sweater so big it looked as though it might swallow her whole, and she was comfortable in herself, in the way that difficult teenage years had finally settled into a person who fit inside her own skin. And the photograph had caught that moment. The moment when Ginny had finally become Ginny, and 4 months later she vanished. And that moment froze forever on the edge of a smile that never got to finish. He thought about the empire. At first, he had built it to find Ginny because the police didn't look, because the FBI didn't look, because the system was designed not to look. And he had decided that if the system didn't work, then he would build his own. And he had built it, with money and violence, and the kind of cold intelligence only pain sharpened over a long enough time can forge. Then the empire grew larger than its original purpose. The way every empire grows larger than what first created it, and he built it for control, because control was the only thing that kept him from feeling the helplessness the night Ginny disappeared had taught him. And then he built it because he didn't know any other way to live. Because if he stopped, the stillness would come. And inside the stillness was Ginny's face, and the question he had no answer for. Where are you? Are you still alive? Are you waiting for me? And those questions lived inside silence, the way fish live in water. They belonged there. They didn't leave. He thought about Sloan, about the way she had said, "Let go of my hand" at Brennan's on Thursday night. 3 words. No shaking, no pleading. 3 words that 99% of the people in that room wouldn't have had the courage to say, even though they had all heard Beck, all seen Marshall on the floor, all known what was right and what was wrong, and all chosen wrong because choosing right came with a price, and they weren't willing to pay it. Sloan paid it. Sloan had been paying it for 2 years in ways no one knew. And tonight, when Beck grabbed her wrist, she paid it again, in front of everybody, with 3 words and with feet that didn't move and a pulse beating fast in her throat that she didn't try to hide, because hiding it would have meant pretending she wasn't afraid. And she didn't pretend, she was afraid, and she stood there anyway. And Reed Ashford knew that was the only definition of courage he accepted. He took out his phone and opened Ginny's photograph. Thanksgiving, the oversized sweater, the unfinished smile. He looked at it for a long time. He didn't say anything to the photograph because he had already said everything there was to say in parking lots and motel rooms and cemeteries outside Las Vegas over the last 5 years. And what remained now wasn't words but carrying it forward, waking up every morning with that weight on his chest and getting to his feet anyway. He set the phone face down on the nightstand. 3 in the morning. He got up and sat in the chair by the window looking out at the motel parking lot and the highway beyond it and the Nevada desert sky, where the stars were doing what stars had always done, and he sat there with the map of the warehouse in his head, and 18 seconds of darkness, and Sloan's face, and Ginny's face, and the distance between those two faces, a distance he would spend everything he had to close. And for the first time in a very long while, sleep came before the thoughts could. It came without asking, without negotiation. It simply came, as if his body had decided that tonight it would give him what he needed for tomorrow, whether his mind agreed or not. At 5 o'clock Friday evening, the parking lot behind Brennan's lay under the long shadow of the single light pole cast across the cracked asphalt. It was still light out, but the day was already turning, the Nevada desert beginning to swallow the sunlight from the rim of the horizon inward, and Reed stood facing Sloan in the narrow space between the dumpster and the back wall of the kitchen, where the smell of frying grease and lemon cleaner drifted out from the vent fan and mixed with the dry dust scent of the desert into something Sloan would remember long after tonight, because it was the smell of the moment she learned how to keep herself alive. Reed didn't teach her the way men performed for effect, or the way gym instructors taught. He taught directly, without sentiment, without romanticizing any of it, in an even voice, with slow hands, and the precision of a man who had used these techniques in real life, not on padded mats. Eyes, he said. Thumb or 2 fingers into the eyes. No hesitation, no half measure, because if you hesitate, you give him time to react and he will use that time. Throat, the hollow between the collarbones. Strike upward with the heel of your hand. You don't need much force. Anatomy will do the rest. The nearest hard object within reach. Anything at all. Tray, coffee pot, glass, keys. And if you hold keys the right way, they stop being keys. And the way to break a wrist hold. He took her wrist to demonstrate, and Sloan went rigid for half a second, because a man's hand on her wrist brought Beck back immediately. Thursday night, the thumb pressed into her pulse, but Reed's hand was different. It held tightly enough to demonstrate and lightly enough that she knew she could pull away at any time, and that difference was small. But it was the distance between control and protection, and her body recognized it before her mind did. Turn, he said. Don't pull. Turn, toward the thumb. That's the weakest point of anyone holding your wrist. Mechanical advantage lives at the weakest point, not in your strength, and Sloan turned and her wrist slipped free from his hand the first time, the second time, the third time, each one faster than the last, her body beginning to memorize the pattern somewhere beneath consciousness, in the way the body memorizes things when survival depends on it. Sloan wasn't someone born with a gift for fighting, but she learned quickly. Quickly in the way Reed recognized came not from courage, but from the clarity of someone who had run out of room for self-deception. She needed these things, and knowing that made her focus with an intensity most people never bring to anything. By 7 in the evening, she was sweating in the cooling desert air and breathing hard, and had broken free from Reed's grip twice in a row without thinking, her body reacting on its own, and she stopped and looked down at her hands, the same hands that carried plates, and poured coffee, and counted the register drawer. And now they knew one more thing, something she had never imagined she would need to know. Then something broke open inside her, in the way things break open when a person is tired enough and safe enough, and standing in the dark beside someone, her body has decided to trust before her mind gives permission. Ginny, Sloan said softly, not looking at Reed but at her own hands. I knew her. Not directly. I saw her picture. In Beck's files. He keeps files on every job. I saw it for the first time 6 months after I started, in the desk drawer at his bar when he was drunk and passed out, and I opened it because I was looking for anything I could use. And I saw her picture, and her name, Genevieve Ashford, and I knew she was one of the first. Reed stood very still. Still in the way he became still, when something touched the place where he kept Ginny, the place no one was allowed to touch. And Sloan had just touched it not with intention but with truth, and truth never asks permission before it arrives. Every job after that, Sloan said. Every time I was inside, I looked for her. In every group of women, in every list, in every place they brought me to, I looked for her face. She lifted her eyes to Reed for the first time since she had begun speaking. I haven't found her. 2 years and I still haven't found her. She stopped, but I never stopped looking. The parking lot went quiet. The pole light hummed faintly above them. The desert beyond the diner's back wall darkened further, the sky turning from orange to violet, to that deep black blue only the desert can make. Reed didn't answer with words. He had lived 36 years, and for most of that time he answered everything with words or action or money or violence, because those were the 4 languages he knew best. But standing in Brennan's parking lot at 7 o'clock on Friday evening, listening to a 27-year-old girl say, "I never stopped looking for your sister," none of those 4 languages was enough. None of them reached the right place, and instead he took off his coat, the heavy, expensive black leather coat he wore like armor between himself and the world, and draped it over Sloane's shoulders, not looking at her, not speaking, his hand settling the coat over her and releasing it in a single motion he hadn't planned and hadn't controlled. A reflex, his body deciding to protect her before his mind gave permission, and Sloan stood there in the parking lot wearing a coat too broad for her shoulders, warm and heavy, and carrying the scent of expensive cologne and leather, and she didn't say thank you, because between them now, thank you would have broken something. Silence was keeping intact, and they stood there a while longer behind the diner under the single light pole while the first stars appeared over the Nevada sky, the 2 of them saying nothing, and that silence was the closest thing to a promise either of them was willing to come near just yet. Frank Doyle found Reed at 7 o'clock Saturday morning in the hotel parking lot. Reed was standing there doing the morning stretching routine. He kept not out of habit, but because a 36-year-old body with a scar running down one arm and a history of violence needed maintenance, not punishment. Frank drove up in his truck and sat inside for a while before getting out, the kind of sitting a man does when he's gathering courage. Then he stepped out carrying a manila envelope. "I was up all night," Frank said. "I know that feeling," Reed said. Frank handed him the envelope. "This is everything I know. Tonight's transfer schedule. Personnel. The communication chain above Beck. The last location they ever gave me for Maisie 6 months ago. It's not exact, but it's something." Reed took the envelope and had just started to open it when Frank added, "There's something else," and his voice changed, thinner now, like a wire pulled almost to the breaking point. "Based on the transfer schedule and the location they gave me last time," Reed looked up. "There's a chance Maisie's in the warehouse tonight, and not just Maisie. In the list I saw names I recognized from earlier jobs, and one of them," Frank stopped. "One of them was Genevieve Ashford. In the hotel parking lot at 7 in the morning, with the Nevada sun just coming up and still carrying some of the night's coolness, Reed Ashford's face did several things at once that he normally never allowed. Hope and horror arrived together, the 2 of them pressing against each other on his face for 1 second, before he forced them back down under the layer of control he had spent 12 years sharpening while building his empire. But Frank had seen it. That 1 second was enough, and he understood that to Reed Ashford, this information wasn't data. It was the possibility that his sister was 12 miles away inside a corrugated metal warehouse, and that tonight he might bring her out, or lose the last chance he would ever have. Reed put one hand on the side of the truck to steady himself, the same way Marshall had gripped the counter when Beck kicked away his cane. And that resemblance wasn't accidental. It was inheritance, the way father and son both reached for something physical when something inside them had been shaken. "If Ginny is there," Reed said after his voice leveled out again, "we don't change the plan. We get everyone out. We don't favor anyone, including Ginny, including Maisie, because favoritism is how people die." Frank nodded. "And you need to prepare for the possibility that she isn't there," Reed said. "That getting to her may take longer and require different work. I'm not going to lie to you about that." "I know," Frank said. "I know all of that, but she could be there." "She could," Reed said. And it was the most honest thing he could offer. No decoration, no softening, because Frank Doyle had already been given enough useful stories, and what he needed now was the true terrain of the situation, so he could decide how to stand inside it. Reed spent the next 13 hours preparing. Con and Drew and Reed in the hotel room with the warehouse layout spread across the bed. Every detail Frank had described marked down. The breaker panel on the east wall, the main door, the side door, the distances, and Khan asked the exact questions a man learns to ask after 15 years as a Navy SEAL, about structure, escape routes, the physics of moving people from an enclosed space into open air under controlled conditions. Reed spoke twice more with Nina over a line kept outside the official system, locking down positions and timing. At 4 in the afternoon, he drove to the suburban hospital where Phyllis Mercer was staying and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, thinking about the dying woman inside, who had no idea what her daughter had agreed to do that night. He didn't go in. That wasn't his place. At 6, he ate a sandwich and couldn't have told anyone what it tasted like. At 7, he checked the folding knife he kept inside his coat, not because it needed checking, but because the routine itself had method, and method was useful when he needed to place his mind beneath the noise it made on its own. At 7:45, Frank Doyle's truck pulled up in front of Sloan's trailer on the outskirts of town. Reed parked 200 yards away, lights off, and watched Sloan step out of her car. Black pants, white blouse, the professional clothes of a waitress going to work a private event, and she walked toward Frank's truck with her back straight and her chin level, and whatever was happening inside her, she had put it in the place where the body didn't advertise it. She didn't look back. Reed thought about Ginny, about whether 5 years earlier someone might have been sitting in a dark parking lot watching his sister walk toward something terrible, someone who knew what it was and had placed themselves between it and her, and he thought about the promise he had made at his grandfather's grave in the cemetery outside Las Vegas, where the Ashford family buried their dead, and whether that promise accumulated, whether each time he kept it added up into something that might someday be enough, or whether each time was its own separate debt, complete and permanent. Frank's truck pulled out and turned east. Reed counted to 30. Then he started the engine. Conan drew behind him, the 3 vehicles moving through the dark with their lights off, following the glow of Frank's taillights far enough back to stay invisible, close enough to catch sight of the warehouse when it appeared, a dark rectangular block against a slightly lighter sky. Corrugated metal walls catching no light because there was no light to catch. Only a single bulb above the side door painting a small yellow rectangle on the gravel. Frank's truck stopped. Sloan stepped out. She stood by the truck for 1 second. Reed was too far away to read her face, only her posture, straight, contained. She walked toward the light. The door opened before she reached it. Then she was inside and the door became wall again. Reed breathed. 30 seconds. Then he switched on the receiver Nina had given him, tuned to the frequency of the wire Sloan was wearing, and listened. Sloan's voice, clear and steady, asking where to leave her bag. Another voice answering. Male, flat, performing normalcy. The background sound of the warehouse, the echo of a large metal space, and underneath it, the thing Reed's ear caught before his conscious mind had time to name it. Voices. Many voices. Low, whispering. The specific sound made by people trapped in a space who had learned that speaking louder than a whisper cost more than it was worth. Con pulled in beside him in the dark. Engine nearly silent. Drew behind him. All 3 listened. 4 minutes. Beck's voice when he entered from the other room. The satisfaction in it. The satisfaction of a man whose plan had reached exactly the point it was supposed to reach. Sloan's voice answering. Measured, careful, not performing fear but not hiding it entirely either, because hiding it entirely would have been its own kind of signal. 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Then something changed in the quality of the room coming through the receiver. Movement. The kind of movement that comes right before something else. Beck's voice closer to the wire now, carrying a different quality. Then the sound of tearing. Then silence on the frequency. Reed was already moving before the silence had fully finished becoming itself. Reed hit Nina's channel while his boots were already on the gravel, and his mouth was already saying, "The wire's down. We're going in." Nina's voice came back at once, controlled but fast. "My team isn't in position yet. I need 8 minutes." And Reed said, "I don't have 8 minutes." Then cut the channel, because 8 minutes inside that warehouse with Beck knowing the wire had been discovered was 8 minutes Sloan didn't have, and he wasn't going to stand outside counting them. Con didn't need an explanation. He had heard it on his own receiver, and he moved at the same time Reed did, the 2 of them crossing the gravel toward the warehouse with the lights off, darkness working for them now, in the way darkness works for anyone who knows how to use it. Drew came behind them, the 3 men moving across the open ground, making no more noise than 3 shadows. 200 yards, then 100. The yellow bulb above the side door was close enough to read by, And Reed read the door, read the hardware, read the chain and padlock looped through the outside handles with the lazy confidence of people inside who didn't think anyone from the outside was coming. Con was behind Reed with bolt cutters pulled from the right saddlebag, cutters that had gone through more situations than Con cared to count, and he cut the chain and opened the door in the time it took Reed to cover the last 10 yards to the wall. The door opened inward. Reed went through. The warehouse was exactly as Frank had described it, large enough that the single bulb hanging from a wire was almost useless, throwing only a yellow circle into the middle, and leaving the edges of the room in darkness that eyes needed time to adjust to, and time was what Reed didn't have. But he had something else. He knew where the breaker panel was. East wall, 6 meters from the northeast corner. Old lock, breaker always tripping. Reed turned left along the wall, using it as reference, counting steps. He registered the contents of the room only in fragments while moving. Human shapes sitting along the far wall, zip ties on their wrists, tape over their mouths, eyes wide open following him through the dark, the quality of terrified hope a room develops when something unexpected enters it. And he registered Beck's voice somewhere in the middle of the room, loud now, handling the intrusion with the anger of a man whose plan had been broken open. And he registered Sloan somewhere in the room, not where Beck's voice was coming from, which meant she had moved, which meant she was using what darkness gave her. He found the breaker panel. Standard lock, old, the kind that had been hanging on something too long, key corroded, metal body tired from too many seasons. Reed struck it once with the butt of the bolt cutters, hard, at the lower corner, the mechanical weak point where stress concentrates when the body is twisted instead of pulled. The lock snapped. He opened the panel door, found the main breaker by touch, the largest handle, the one at the top. He pulled. The warehouse went black. Not dim, not reduced, completely black. The kind of black city people forget exists. The kind the desert makes when there is no moon and the stars aren't enough, and the only artificial light source has been removed. The kind of darkness that is an active element of its own, changing the nature of space instead of only changing the level of visibility. For 2 seconds the room was silent from shock. Then it exploded. Reed was already moving toward Beck's voice, working by sound instead of sight, one hand on the wall, stepping over shapes he felt rather than saw. He heard the women along the far wall, sounds that weren't quite words, the sounds of people whose situation had just changed without explanation, and who didn't yet know whether the change was better or worse. He heard Beck shouting for his men, heard footsteps breaking in different directions. From somewhere on the other side of the warehouse came the sound of impact, then the unmistakable sound of a human body hitting the floor, then silence from that direction. She's moving, Reed thought. Good. He found the first of Beck's men by sound, by the controlled breathing of someone trying and failing to stay quiet. Reed covered the last 3 steps with one hand out, found a collar, and that was enough. 30 seconds later, the man was on the floor with one of Khan's zip ties around his wrists. Khan had come in through the door behind Reed, his eyes adjusting to darkness faster than anyone Reed had ever worked with. 15 years as a SEAL, teaching him to see in conditions where ordinary people were blind. Drew moved straight across the room to the women lined along the wall, moving carefully, speaking softly, saying the things he knew had to be said in a moment like this. I'm here to help. You're safe. We're getting you out. Then 3 flashlights cut through the dark from Reed and Khan and Drew, and the darkness shattered into fragments. The room suddenly full of moving light and shadow. Reed swept his beam across the warehouse floor, found Beck. He was down on one knee near the middle of the room, one hand pressed to the side of his face where it had met something hard and fast, the other hand moving toward his waistband with the deliberate slowness of a man angry enough to stop calculating consequences. Reed's flashlight found the gun. Then Sloan stepped into the light. She had come from the direction of the breaker panel. She had used the absolute darkness to reach for a discarded metal shard on the floor, and with a desperate strength, she used its jagged edge to saw through the zip ties binding her wrists. It had worked, though the metal tore into her skin. Both wrists carried deep, raw lacerations that would surely leave a scar. And on the warehouse floor, she had found a piece of rebar, about 2 feet long, rusted and solid, and her hands had known what they needed before her mind had fully finished asking. She struck Beck's gun hand hard enough to send the weapon flying 3 meters across the concrete until it skidded against the firewall. Beck made a sound that had nothing to do with his public image, the raw, involuntary sound of small bones being rearranged without warning. He turned toward her, Sloan struck the soft point beneath his jaw, not with killing force, but with the precise, measured force of someone taught exactly where pressure had to land to end something without ending it forever. Reed had taught her that in Brennan's parking lot the afternoon before, and she had practiced it 3 times, and her body had stored it somewhere beneath consciousness. Beck went down. He stayed down. Sloan stood over him, breathing hard, white blouse torn at the shoulder where someone had grabbed her, a cut above her left eye, her whole body trembling, adrenaline completing its cycle. And her eyes, the blue-gray eyes Reed had first seen across the counter at Brennan's on Thursday night, were clear. She looked at him. "I handled it," she said. "I know," Reed said. "I know you did." The next 11 minutes were controlled chaos. Khan restrained Beck's 2 remaining men without injuring either one. 4 minutes. Clean. Efficient. The way 15 years as a SEAL teaches a man to work in an enclosed space filled with civilians. Drew counted. 16 women. Ages ranging from around 17 to the mid-30s. 2 needed immediate medical attention for dehydration. He marked them and kept moving through the room, speaking quietly to each one in the steady voice of a man who understood that liberation could be frightening in its own way, just as captivity was, that a room changing without warning still asked something of the people inside it, and that they needed time to understand the change was better, not worse. Reed stood in the middle of the warehouse and let his team work, because this was what they had built over 12 years, the ability to operate, and he watched Sloan. She had set the piece of rebar down. She was kneeling beside the women Drew hadn't reached yet, cutting zip ties with the knife Reed had pressed into her hand when he entered the warehouse, and her nursing school training had come alive in the way real training comes alive under real conditions. Automatic, beneath the level of decision, the body knowing what to do before the mind has finished deciding. She checked pulses. She checked pupils with the small flashlight Drew handed her. She spoke softly to each woman in the voice patients need to hear. Steady, warm, real. The voice that says, "I am here and I know what I am doing and you are safe." She reached the 3rd woman from the left. Then she stopped. Reed saw it happen on her face from the other side of the warehouse. Something different from everything that had come before that night. Not the controlled fear from when she wore the wire, not the adrenaline clarity of darkness and rebar, but something older and larger. Something that reached back to the conversation in the parking lot the afternoon before when she had said, "I never stopped looking," all the way back to the photograph in Beck's file she had seen 6 months after she started, all the way back to the name Genevieve Ashford that she had carried in her mind for 2 years through every job, every list, every face. The woman in front of Sloan was 26 years old, thin in the way years of not having enough food make a person thin, structural, not temporary, bone and angles instead of curves, hair past her shoulders tied back with a piece of rope. When Sloan cut the zip ties from her wrists, there were marks there from long and repeated restraint. Skin turned, the color skin should never be. And the jaw. Marshall Ashford's jaw, which Sloan had seen on Thursday night when she helped him to his feet from the diner floor. That line, that angle, and the eyes, brighter than Reed's, brighter than Marshall's, as if this girl had kept the part of the family's light that had been divided up while her brother and father had taken the gray. Sloan said something too softly for Reed to hear from across the warehouse. The woman answered. Sloan placed both hands on the woman's face the way people do when they need to truly see someone, need to confirm that the face in front of them is real, and not something 2 years of searching have built out of hope and bad light. And she looked, for a long time, and the face between her hands looked back at her, and it was real. Sloan turned toward Reed, and the expression on her face was one he recognized because he had seen it before, in other rooms and other situations. The expression of someone whose abstraction has just become concrete, whose cause has just taken the shape of a real face, whose reason has just become flesh. "She's here," Sloan said. "Reed, she's here." Reed crossed the warehouse floor. Every step was 5 years. Every step was every night he had looked at the Thanksgiving photograph. Every unanswered call. The empire he had built from ashes and violence and desperation. Every time he had asked the Nevada desert at 3 a.m, "Where are you?" and the desert had not answered. Ginny Ashford, 26 years old. 5 years. She looked at Reed, and he didn't know whether she recognized him because 5 years changes everything. 5 years in which he, on the outside, had gone from a 31-year-old building an empire into a 36-year-old man standing in a warehouse with split knuckles. and 5 years in which she, on the inside, had gone from the girl smiling at the kitchen counter in an oversized sweater to a woman with her hair tied back with rope and marks around her wrists. Then she looked past him, toward the door, toward the darkness outside where the desert night was waiting. "Dad," she said, her voice rough from being used so little. "Is Dad outside?" "Dad is outside," Reed said, and for the first time in 48 hours, his voice wasn't entirely steady. It trembled at the edges in the way a voice trembles when what you've kept inside too long finds a crack and starts to come through. "Dad has been outside this building, one way or another, for a very long time, trying to get to you." Ginny Ashford stood up slowly, her body relearning the mechanics of standing freely, mechanics that 5 years of restriction had nearly erased from muscle memory, and she walked toward the light from the door Con had braced open, toward the night outside and the air of freedom, and the sky full of stars she hadn't seen for so long that she had forgotten there could be that many. And on the other side of the warehouse, almost at the same time, something else happened that Reed saw only from the corner of his eye but enough to understand. Frank Doyle had come into the warehouse at some point, maybe right after Nina's team gave the all clear, and he was standing in front of a 27-year-old woman, with his eyes but brighter, and he stood there without moving, both hands hanging at his sides, and the young woman looked at him, and neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was so heavy, it seemed to have gravity of its own, 5 years compressed into the 2-meter distance between father and daughter. And Reed didn't look longer than that, because some things repeat themselves without needing words and without needing witnesses from outside. Reed walked back along the gravel toward Frank's truck, where Marshal Ashford stood beside the front of it, his arms hanging at his sides, his cane resting against the body of the truck. His eyes narrowed as he tried to read from 200 yards away in the dark what was happening inside the warehouse, reading the movement of flashlights, reading the silhouettes going in and out through the propped open door, trying to tell which shadow among them was his daughter, which one was hope, and which one was the mirage that 5 years of waiting could make out of bad light and desperation. He heard Reed's footsteps on the gravel before he saw him, and he turned toward the sound with his whole body, because his right leg didn't allow him the luxury of turning only his head, and on his face in the weak, distant light was the question he had carried for 5 years, the question he had driven 430 miles from Carson City to ask, the question he had been thrown to the floor at Brennan's for daring to ask, and now it was written across his face without words because some questions are too large for a mouth to hold. Reed stopped in front of his father. "She's out," he said. Marshal Ashford made a sound that wasn't language. Hope and relief and 5 years of compressed terror broke loose on his face all at once, and he pressed his hand over his mouth and stood very still, and Reed looked out toward the desert behind him, and gave him the space a man deserves when 5 years of wait leave him all at once, because there are things that happen inside a person when what they have lost returns to them, and those things need room, they need air, they need no one standing close enough that presence starts to feel like pressure. "Is she all right?" Marshall asked when his voice returned, and even then it was being held together by effort. "She'll need time," Reed said, "and care, and people who understand that coming back from something like this isn't a moment, but a long process. But she's standing, she's speaking, and she knows her own name. The rest is possible." Marshall nodded. He was crying, and he would cry for a long time still, and he didn't try to hide it because some things deserved to be cried over, and the 5 years he had just come to the end of was one of them. Then Ginny came around the side of the truck. She had stepped out of the warehouse into the desert night and moved toward the familiar wash of truck lights she had seen from the warehouse door, and now she saw the truck itself, and she recognized it in the way people recognize things they have spent years refusing to let themselves think about, and yet have never truly forgotten. The dent on the right rear panel from the time her father backed into the parking lot barrier outside the hardware store when she was 13, with her in the passenger seat laughing at him through the windshield, while he pretended to be annoyed even though his eyes were laughing too. And they had laughed all the way home, laughing at something that wasn't really funny except that they were father and daughter. And fathers and daughters laugh together for reasons that don't need explaining to anyone else. The truck was still the same. The dent was still the same. As if the 5 years outside the warehouse had frozen at the moment she was taken, and had waited for her to return so they could go on. Ginny stopped 3 meters from Marshall. Marshall turned. He saw her. She saw him. Neither of them moved, and the 3 meters between them held the accumulated weight of 5 years that could not be crossed all at once. 5 years in which he obeyed the people who had taken his daughter because they kept sending proof she was alive. 5 years in which she existed somewhere in the dark, not knowing what her father was doing to keep her alive. 5 years in which both of them had paid in their own ways and now stood 3 meters apart, and those 3 meters asked something of them both that neither had words for, and both had in abundance. Marshall moved first. He crossed those 3 meters without grace, without the careful self-possession of a man managing his own collapse, his right leg dragging over the gravel because it wouldn't cooperate. But he didn't care because his right leg hadn't cooperated in 8 years, and it had never once stopped him from going where he needed to go. Ginny met him halfway. She stepped toward him, and the distance between them vanished, not slowly but all at once, as if it had never existed, as if those 3 meters had been the illusion 5 years had made, and truth had now erased. Reed turned away. He turned his back because there are things not meant for outsiders to witness, because there are things that belong entirely to the people inside them, and a father finding his daughter again after 5 years is one of those things, and the one standing closest ought to be the desert, because the desert doesn't judge, and doesn't retell, and doesn't ask anything of a moment, except to hold it. He looked toward the desert. Behind him he heard Marshall say his daughter's name. 1 syllable. Jen. The shortened version only her father used. The version Ginny hadn't heard in 5 years, and now it landed in the desert night heavy and light at the same time. Heavy because 5 years were inside that single syllable. Light because at last the syllable had found the person it belonged to. Then Reed heard nothing except the desert and the distant activity of the official scene and the settling silence that comes when something broken for a very long time begins. Slowly, and without any guarantee of completion, to heal, he stood with the desert in front of him and gave them the time it needed. It needed a great deal. He gave all of it, and while he stood there, he thought about Sloan inside the warehouse cutting zip ties from the remaining women, about the way her hand held the knife steady, even though her wrists were burned, and one of her ribs might have been cracked, and the blood from the cut above her left brow kept slipping into her eye, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand and kept going, about the way she had said I never stopped looking in the parking lot the afternoon before. And now, what she had been looking for was standing outside the warehouse, under the Nevada stars in her father's arms, and Reed thought that there is a kind of debt no money can repay, and no violence can erase, and that kind of debt can be repaid in only one way, by becoming worthy of it, and he didn't yet know whether he was worthy, but he knew he would spend whatever remained of his life trying to find out. Nina found Reed at the edge of the gravel lot, 20 minutes after the official scene processing began, and the women were being brought outside, and Beck was lying in the county police car with zip ties still around his wrists. Whitmore was taken in at Nogales, Nina said. 2 transport trucks. He was there for 3 hours waiting for this delivery. Carroll's team from the FBI with federal authority coordinated directly with Border Patrol. Reed absorbed the information. Hollis, he asked. Detained 40 minutes earlier, Nina said. 2 agents from FBI Internal Affairs were also briefed tonight. He tried to redirect Carroll's team 20 minutes ago by claiming there was an officer safety situation at a secondary site and forces needed to be reassigned, but it didn't work because I called Carroll's superior this afternoon and laid out everything I had on Hollis. 20 months of documentation, payment trails, disappeared protected witnesses, 3 prior investigations killed from the inside, and her superior said it was the most thorough file she'd received in her career. Reed thought about Hollis for 1 second, not with anger because anger would have been easier, but with the cold recognition of a man who understood how a human being becomes what Hollis had become, one compromise and then another, each one smaller than the last because you have already accepted its principle, until the compromises become structure, and the person who made the first one can no longer be found beneath them. Then Nina said there was more, and her voice changed, and Reed knew that voice. He had known it from too many conversations in his life where the person speaking was carrying something they didn't want to hand over but had to. In the course of building the case against Whitmore, Nina said carefully, we traced the data source, the network used to identify targets, the method they used to select vulnerable women. 3 years ago, Whitmore's operation bought a data set from a third-party research organization called Harbor Foundation. Harbor Foundation ran surveys and needs assessments in partnership with social service providers. She stopped. 2 years ago, the Ashford Empire funded Harbor Foundation through the legitimate front. Paige Ashford managed. Your money, your brand, and the data that organization collected included information you provided through the charitable projects of the empire you built, and that data went straight to Whitmore. The Nevada desert night was very still, stars overhead. the corrugated warehouse wall behind them, police lights sweeping across the gravel in their steady, indifferent rhythm. 45 women were targeted using data sourced in part from the Ashford Empire, Nina said. 28 of them were taken. 4 may have been in the warehouse tonight. Reed stood in the Nevada darkness with that information, and it hit him in a completely different place from everything else that had hit him that night. It struck at the foundation, at the place on which he had built everything else, at the belief he needed in order to get out of bed every morning, that the empire he had built, even with violence and dirty money and control, at least served a purpose, at least bent toward the light even by a road that passed through darkness. And now he knew that road had created its own darkness, and that darkness had faces, 19 faces. And 4 of them may have sat along the wall of this warehouse tonight, watching him cut the chain on the door, without knowing that the man rescuing them was also the man whose empire had helped place them here. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "I built this to find Ginny, then for control, then because I didn't know any other way to live." And he wasn't speaking to Nina. He was speaking to the desert, to the stars, to the 19 faces whose names he didn't yet know but would. 28, he said. Nina looked at him. "Are you going to collapse?" she asked. "Not tonight," Reed said. "Maybe later, but not tonight. Because collapsing is a luxury for people who no longer have duties." And he still had duties. To the 16 women in the warehouse, and to Ginny, and to Marshall, and to Frank, and to Sloan, who was still inside with burned wrists and a cracked rib cutting zip ties off other people. And to the 19 women he owed something he didn't yet know the name for, but knew the weight of. Nina put a hand on his arm for 1 second, a gesture from an ally, not a friend, then turned back toward the scene, and Reed stood alone at the edge of the desert for a while longer, simply standing in the dark, simply breathing, because sometimes the desert asks that of a man, to just stand inside it until it is finished with him. Sloan called at 4 a.m. from the emergency room, and her voice over the phone carried the quality of someone who had gone through the worst thing and discovered she was still awake, still breathing, still capable of dialing a number with burned fingers, and speaking with a mouth that still hadn't entirely lost the taste of blood from the cut above her left brow. 3 cracked ribs, she said, mild concussion, burns on both wrists. The doctor says, I'm lucky, and she didn't tell the doctor that luck had nothing to do with any of it, because she didn't have the energy to explain. How's your mother? Reed asked, and he asked that before anything else, because he knew that was the first thing in Sloan's mind, even though she had just come out of a warehouse with 3 cracked ribs and burned wrists, because Sloan Mercer was the kind of person who, even while the world was collapsing on her shoulders, still asked first whether the person she loved was all right. Sleeping, Sloan said. They moved her to a better room this morning. Nina's people handled the insurance. She starts the trial treatment on Monday. Good, Reed said. Silence on the line, the sounds of the hospital behind her, machines, nurses' shoes on the floor, the sounds of the place people go when the body has endured more than it was designed to bear. Reed, Sloan said. When the wire went down and I knew the plan had failed, I used the darkness you created to find a sharp edge and cut through the zip ties. I knew I had to be ready when you came through that door. No, Reed said, but it was right. Silence. I kept thinking about what you said that afternoon in the parking lot, Sloan said, about how a plan ends at the point where a person has to make a choice, and you either trust that person or you don't. And I thought if I didn't do anything, you'd come through that door into the light where Beck could see you from across the room, and I wasn't going to let that happen. You were right, Reed said, and he said it evenly. But inside him something shifted when he heard her say I wasn't going to let that happen, because it meant that in the darkest moment of the darkest night, when the wire had been ripped away and Beck knew and everything had fallen apart, the first thing Sloan Mercer had thought about wasn't how to save herself, but how to keep him from dying, when he came through that door to save her, and he didn't know what to do with that knowledge except carry it and let it change him in the way it needed to. A long silence on the line. I want to go back, Sloan said. When my mother's stable, when the semester starts, I want to finish my nursing degree, and then I want to do this, the right way. Not alone in the dark anymore, but the right way. Study first, Reed said. Study first, Sloan agreed. But after that we'll talk, Reed said. You have my word. Sloan said good night, and hung up. And Reed sat in the dark motel room looking at the phone in his hand, and thinking about her alone in the emergency room. 3 cracked ribs, wrists bandaged, and he knew he shouldn't go because there was no tactical reason, no business reason, no reason at all in any of the 4 languages he spoke fluently that could justify a mafia boss driving to a hospital at 4:30 in the morning to sit beside the bed of a waitress he had known for 48 hours. But he drove there anyway because there was a 5th reason he had refused to name for 48 hours. And now, at 4 in the morning on Sunday, after the warehouse, and after Beck, and after the 19, and after Ginny holding Marshall beneath the stars, he no longer had the strength to refuse it. He got to the emergency room, gave her name at the desk, was led inside, and sat down in the chair beside her bed. Sloan was asleep. Her face under the hospital lights carried the look only sleep after complete exhaustion can bring, open and undefended in the way she would never allow herself to be while awake. White bandages wrapped both wrists, protecting the deep marks left by the jagged metal she had used to free herself in the dark. The hands that poured coffee and counted the register drawer and cut zip ties off 16 women and held the piece of rebar that brought Tyson Beck down now lay on the white sheet, small and still. Reed set his hand beside hers on the bed, not touching, beside, close enough to feel the warmth of her, far enough that she wouldn't know unless she woke. But Sloan opened her eyes, blue-gray eyes. The dark circles were still there, but beneath them was something else. Not exhaustion, not fear, but peace. The kind of peace that comes only after you have gone through the worst thing and found that on the other side there isn't an abyss but solid ground. She looked at his hand beside hers. "Have you been here long?" she asked. "Longer than I should have," he said. "Why?" she asked. "Because you're the first person in a very long time," he said, "who's made me want to stay instead of leave." Sloan said nothing. She turned her hand slowly, because it hurt, because her burned wrists and cracked ribs protested every movement, and she laid her hand over his. Her fingers tightened gently. He tightened back. The scarred hand of a mafia boss holding the wounded hand of a waitress, and neither of them said anything. And the silence between them wasn't the kind that needed filling. It was the kind already full of 48 hours, and the warehouse, and the darkness, and 3 words, and 9 women, and Ginny and Owen, and 19 faces without names. And inside that silence, between the soft, steady beeping of the heart monitor and the cold, white hospital light, something existed between them that wasn't a promise. Not yet, but the possibility of one. The space before someone decides to step into it. And both of them were standing at the edge of it. And both of them knew. 1 year later. April. Brennan's was no longer Brennan's. The old sign with the missing apostrophe and the burned-out bulb had been replaced by a new one. Navy blue letters on a white background, clean and clear. Ginny and Owens. And beneath it, in smaller print, a training center for women working toward a better future. The building hadn't been torn down and rebuilt because Reed wanted to keep the place where specific things had happened and turn it into something else from the inside out. That was harder than building new, but it was the only honest way, because honesty meant acknowledging the past instead of erasing it. The commercial kitchen in back now supported food service certification training. 2 classrooms had been added to the original structure for vocational skills and job readiness. The medical station opened on Tuesdays and Thursdays, staffed by volunteer nurses coordinated by Sloan from her final semester at the University of Arizona, and she drove 2 hours each week to keep it running. The counseling room in what had once been Frank's office now had soft chairs and gentle light, and a direct phone line to county victim services, with counselors recruited by Nina, and in the 6 weeks since the pilot opening, 9 women had used it. On the last Saturday morning of April, the parking lot was full. Nevada Spring still carried a memory of winter in the early air, dry and bright, and the desert brush was showing that brief green particular to the few weeks before the sun reclaimed it. 40 chairs had been set in rows inside, waiting for people to arrive. Reed stood outside with coffee in his hand. He looked at the building, looked at the sign, and he was different from a year earlier. Not softer, because Reed Ashford didn't soften, but wider somehow, as if he had added a room inside himself that he hadn't known was there before, a room where something other than control and violence and desperation was allowed to live. Con Walsh was arranging coffee cups on the service table, with the same system he brought to everything. Drew was managing the parking lot because somebody had parked on top of somebody else. Marshall Ashford drove in with the truck, the dent in the rear panel still there, and stepped out with his cane. Slower than before in some ways, gentler with himself, learning for the first time in 5 years that being careful was worth practicing. But his back was straighter now. his head higher, in the way a person's head rises when the weight on their shoulders has finally been lifted. Ginny stood beside him, 27 years old, moving differently, carrying that quality in the way she occupied space that spoke of recalibration, of a person learning again what safety feels like, so the body can stop performing vigilance every second of every minute. She saw a therapist in Tucson twice a week, driving 2 hours with the determination of someone who had decided that kind of work was worth the distance. She had enrolled at the community college in the next county, studying business administration, and when Sloan heard the news over the phone, she had sat with it for a long while with something inside her that wasn't exactly happiness, but belonged to the same family. Frank Doyle stood at the edge of the lot, out on parole and restricted to the county, working at the hardware store on Main Street, because the 63-year-old owner had offered him the job, a man who had lived in Redemption Falls his whole life and understood without needing to be told that people are made of everything they've been through, not only the worst thing they've done. Maisie stood beside him, 28 years old, and the distance between father and daughter was still being adjusted, still being measured again every day. But she was there, and he was there, and sometimes that was enough. Phyllis Mercer had been out of the hospital for 4 months, the trial treatment producing what the oncologist called a significant response, using the precise language medicine uses for what the people who loved Phyllis called something else, something more hopeful, more private. She was thinner now and slower in her movements, but she laughed more easily, and Reed had noticed that in the 2 times he had seen her, and filed it away as the kind of data that tells you something true about a human being. Bev Kinney stood at the back of the room, 69 now, arms crossed, eyes sharp, watching everything from the position she had held for 22 years, in the back, and she nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone who had waited a very long time to see something change, and had finally seen it. Paige Ashford was talking with Nina Valdez by the window, the 2 women having found something to respect in one another across a complicated year, a mafia lawyer and a police lieutenant standing side by side drinking coffee and making small talk, and the world not collapsing because of it. Sloan arrived last. She drove the Honda Civic with the cracked windshield still there because she refused to repair it, saying it was a reminder of things worth remembering, and Reed respected that philosophy even though he could have bought her 10 new cars without noticing the money was gone. She stepped out wearing her nursing clinical clothes, the practical uniform of someone who spends 12 hours on her feet, and over them she wore the leather jacket Reed had brought to her graduation in Tucson 3 months earlier, heavy and warm and carrying on the back the patch of the organization they were building, and her name embroidered beneath it. She crossed the parking lot with the same walk Reed had first seen through the diner window on Thursday night 1 year before. The same efficiency, the same containment, but the weight underneath it had been organized now, arranged, set in its proper relation to the other things she carried, which meant she could carry it alongside everything else, rather than in place of everything else. She stopped beside Reed outside the door. "How many people?" she asked, looking across the lot. "About 60, Reed said. "Bev's inside. Your mother's inside. Are you ready?" Reed asked. "I've been thinking about something," Sloan said, and Reed waited because he had learned in the past year that when Sloan said she had been thinking about something, whatever came next was usually worth waiting for. "I spent 2 years believing that what I was doing in the dark was enough," Sloan said. "That 9 people was enough. That fighting alone was enough. And then I found out it wasn't enough, that while I was saving 9, 28 others went through the same door and I couldn't stop them. And I kept wondering whether that erased everything, whether it's possible to keep building when the foundation already has cracks you didn't see." She looked at Reed. "And I think the answer isn't choosing between clean and already damaged. It's choosing between open eyes and closed eyes, between admitting what you've caused and running from it. You know that better than anyone," she said softly, because the 28 Faces and Harbor Foundation and the Ashford Empire still stood between them, not as a barrier but as ground, the thing both of them had decided to stand on, instead of burying beneath themselves. "Owen used to say," Sloan said, "that the medics who lost the most patients were the ones who stopped being honest with themselves about what they were facing. He said the job wasn't to be perfect. It was to see clearly and keep working." "He sounds like he was worth knowing," Reed said. "Very much," Sloan said. "He would have liked you." "Let's go in," Sloan said. Reed took her hand, in daylight, in front of everyone, for the first time. Not hidden, not calculated, the scarred hand of a mafia boss holding the hand of a former waitress and nursing student whose wounds had healed into white scars. and together they walked in. Sloan stood at the front of the room. 60 people. She spoke in plain, direct language, because plainness was its own form of respect for the people listening. "The work isn't finished," she said. "Not even close. And what we're building here is only a beginning. And anybody who tells you otherwise is selling you something. The reason to do it anyway isn't because it's enough, but because it's what is available. Because the choice between doing something that isn't enough and doing nothing at all isn't a hard choice once you've seen what doing nothing looks like." Reed's sister, Ginny, was never allowed to see what was possible. My brother Owen wasn't either. This building carries both their names because they are part of the reason we're standing here, and I don't think that's a small thing. I think it's almost the biggest thing that can happen to people like us. The room went quiet. Then Bev Kinney started clapping from the back. Exactly the right person to begin because she had been here the longest and had stood closest to the center of the story. And once she started, the room followed, filling with warm, simple applause, the sound of people glad to be somewhere, glad that something existed now that hadn't existed before, glad that the work had found enough people willing to do it. Reed stood at the back of the room, 37 now, the scar down his left arm. In his wallet, the photograph of a girl forever on the edge of an unfinished smile that he would carry until the last day he was still able to carry anything. He looked at Sloan, and Sloan looked back. And what passed between them was the specific understanding of two people who had gone through something together that cannot be translated for anyone who wasn't there, but which had left each of them clearer about themselves than when they began. Outside the door, the April morning in Nevada was briefly green before the sun would take it back. The sky, the sort of blue that promises things it can't keep past June, and in the parking lot, the cracked windshield Civic was parked beside Reed's black Maserati, chrome catching the early light. Patient in the way things built to go far are patient. There was a long road ahead. There always is. That was the whole promise being made and kept. One road at a time. One woman at a time. One warehouse. One parking lot. One name. Adding up into something that might never be enough and was worth doing anyway. Reed Ashford had learned across 36 years, and one scar, and one blue gray-eyed girl that worth doing anyway was the most honest thing a human being can come to. He intended to keep finding out how far it could take him. The answer, he suspected, was farther than he could see from here. This story isn't only about the mafia, or warehouses, or dark nights in the desert. It's about choice. About the moment when you are standing in a room where someone needs help, and you have to decide whether to stand up or keep sitting. About the truth that none of us is ever completely clean, and none of us is ever completely broken, and the only thing that separates one kind of person from another is whether you open your eyes to what you've caused and choose to do differently. If you're listening to this story and it touched something real inside you, I want to hear that. Have you ever stood in front of a choice like Sloan's? Have you ever had to decide between your own safety and doing what was right for someone else? Have you ever carried something heavy alone for too long without anyone knowing? Share it with me in the comments below because I read every comment and every story you tell is part of why I keep making these videos. If today's story meant something to you, please hit like so I know I'm heading in the right direction. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories every day. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening from beginning to end. That means more to me than you know. I wish all of you watching this video today very good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.